Welcome to the Joyosity podcast. I am so glad that you're joining us. Whether you are a seasoned leader or you're really just starting out, you belong in the Joyosity community. And if you're new to Joyosity, we base our work on the podcast here on these three bedrock beliefs. One, that true leadership requires more than surface level strategies. It requires a connection to everything that makes us human. And two, we use genuine curiosity so we can create the positive culture with complex people, because those complex people are all that we have to work with. And that joy is the heartbeat of a healthy leader and a healthy organization. So we're putting joy and fun right in the center of our work. And every week we bring you dynamic conversations with experts and leaders. And today I am so excited that Moe Carrick is our just expert in the field of culture. And she is going to share with us more than just a couple tips. She is a part of what we are doing to build a movement with you based on hard-won wisdom, real-life experiences, and leading research. So if you're new to me, I'm Jen Whitmer, international speaker and leadership consultant, and I like to say all-around joy bringer. And I am your host that's guiding us along. And together, we're going to move from ideas to action, and in really embracing those challenges that come with being a leader in a dynamic and ever-changing world. So you might want to grab your multiple beverages, maybe some pens, because you will hear some of those quotes that you want to write down, or that, oh my gosh, gut punch, deep insight that will transform you as a person and as a leader. So let's welcome Moe. So before I bring her on, I just have to introduce her to you a little bit, because, the accolades are deep and wide. She is an internationally respected pioneer in the study and practice of workplace culture. So, of course, she's perfect for Joyosity. She has award-winning frameworks and tools, and she's used them in many of the country's most recognized brands, just to name drop a few of Amazon, Nintendo, Hydro Flask, Nike, those kind of places that really improve culture and reduce all of those things that cause difficulty in businesses, churn and lack of productivity. And over the last 2 decades, she has built these proprietary methods to help us cut burnout across the industry and in all of these different sectors. She is featured 3 times on the TEDx stage. I just have 1. So she's like beating me, which is great. And the author of 3 best-selling books. So she is a mom of multiple kids. We were chatting about that earlier. And she has led lots of teenagers out into the woods. They've all survived, which I think is fantastic. As a fellow woods person, loving taking people out into the woods, and a former middle school teacher, I think that is just a great breeding ground for learning how to lead and practice. So I am so excited to welcome Moe on today. Welcome.
Hi, Jen. Oh, such a great introduction. Thank you. I'm just delighted to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad that you could join us and that we have just started to get to know each other. And I'm thrilled that what you're going to bring to the audience. And so before we jump into the power of culture and what culture really is and how do we work within cultures, give us a little bit of your story. Like, I read the details and the formals, but how did you get to doing this work? Why was this important to you?
I love that. And it's something I've thought a lot about because, as you mentioned, I do have lots of children. They're all young adults. And so we have this conversation a lot, like, how do you end up doing what you do, And for me, as is so true, I think for many of us, it's a bit of a circuitous journey. And
I've never met anyone where it's straightforward.
I know, like, with the best made plans, and I've had jobs that I've loved and jobs that I've really been miserable in, like that have had me on the couch crying. And so I think that every job that I've had has really led me to here. When I think back, though, on how I got here, one of the things I'm aware of is that I was diagnosed with malignant melanoma when I was 19.
Wow.
Which is very young. Yeah.
Very
And,
young.
melanoma was badass skin cancer. And I've now had it 3 times, but I'm grateful to be, in full remission and all of that. But I think being diagnosed at such a young age, at that time I was working as a resident director in a small liberal arts college. And it kind of burned in me this idea of carpe diem. Like, got to get on with it, girl. Like, you don't know how long you're going to have. So do the things that you want. And so that was kind of really why, although I was an English major in college and I thought I'd be a journalist. I had a little deadline issue. So that was not the career for me. So I ended up becoming a
fellow
working.
Enneagram 7. I understand that.
Totally. Oh my God, we're like twins separated at birth. So I ended up becoming a guide. I worked in the wilderness for many, many years with kids for Knowles and Outward Bound, and loved that work. And then eventually found my way into advanced study of organizational development, which is the field that I come from, and jumped ship really from more of a clinical and wilderness-based environment into a corporate environment. And along the way, had one of those jobs that at times was enlivening. I worked for what was then Cellular One, which it was actually called Macaw Cellular One, just about to be purchased by AT&T. The phones then were the size like a bread box. And it was all analog. There was no digital. Like I'm
in the car, like with the bag,
yeah,
the bag
yeah,
phone.
the bag, totally. I have distinct memories of calling my dad in employee orientation with the phone like this. I'm talking to you from downtown Seattle, and he was like, "Oh, that's amazing." But I love that job in many ways, and also it was a very difficult job. And I think the combination of having had a fairly lively young adult career, although it didn't generate any money for me, and then kind of a very challenging, enlivening, but also a little bit of a deadening career in corporate America caused me early on to think about what is it that makes us thrive at work, and how can we create more workplaces that really are fit for human life, because we spend so much time there, and if it's really miserable, it really impacts our life. So I think very, very early I had that like paradox of experiences that caused me to kind of be very curious about how we work. And again, underneath the surface always is this idea of we don't get to choose when we leave this great earth. So I wanted to kind of suck the marrow out of it as much as I can by
I
being
deeply
engaged
love
in
that
the
quote. Suck the marrow out of life. I say it regularly.
I
Yeah,
love it.
that's
Love
great.
it.
I love one of the things that I'm always trying to help clients see when I'm working, especially with leadership clients, is that all of your experiences are part of what has made you, and the good things that you enjoyed about something. And also, as we've both experienced difficulties, and many people that I talk to, the difficult toxic culture, or that just maybe not even gotten to toxic yet, but just dysfunctional. And like, how do I do this? This isn't what I wanted. And so looking back and seeing, oh, here's how I got here. Can I be curious about creating something more lively that's more human centered, as the work that you've done? I mean, not everybody goes into this same type of work, but that is still the power for every human to look and say, how did I get here? What are my experiences that brought me here? And what do I want to suck the marrow out of
Well,
and move forward?
yes, and I'm thinking as you're talking too, I'm thinking about how, like many, I think part of my story is that I had a few people. One person comes to mind in particular who really saw me.
Mm, yes.
I had a mentor when I was working for a company called Project Adventure. We did adjunct corporate events and experiences using BMW race cars and ropes courses and all the stuff we did in the 80s. And her name was Anne. She died an untimely death at age 52, but she was a really important mentor for me. She saw me. She saw the gifts that I had. She saw all of me. I was a young mother at that time, really struggling. She was also a young mother. She helped me figure out a way to do this hard work while also mothering. And I often think that if it hadn't been for that leader,
Mm,
who was able to really see me completely, help me see myself in ways that I hadn't imagined, were possible yet, my career might have taken a really different direction in terms of what I paid attention to and what I courageously, stepped into. So I've always been grateful for that relationship. And I
uh,
find that many people have similar stories.
absolutely. And I think that, as we segue into talking about culture,
Mm,
the leader, I mean, all culture issues are leadership issues as we start to define what culture is. But
heck yeah.
the leader who sees you, even just the person who sees you,
Mm,
is so powerful. And yeah, absolutely a part of my story as well. I think back to Mrs. Amar one of my teachers in elementary school who
Mm.
was the first person to not be really annoyed by all of my questions and really taught me even to ask better questions. That is so powerful as a leader and as I continue to grow. But yeah, the
Love
power
it.
of a leader that sees you is really beautiful.
Mhm, mhm.
So, as we talk about leaders that are upholding a culture, let's define some terms. And how do you explain culture? I have an analogy that I use to explain culture, but I'd love to hear when people are like, what is culture? And it's this like, thing that you can't quite put your fingers on. It's hard to get it's because it's not so tangible, even though there are tangible components. What is culture?
Such a good question. Such a good question. And like easier to, yeah, there's like, it's hard to describe culture in a few words. So,
Completely. Yeah.
but I'll try, right? The way I have heard culture described and the definition that I find works the best for me. And again, we're talking specifically of organizational culture here, which is different, of
Mhm,
course, than like regional culture or
mhm,
tribal culture or geographic culture, which is a type of culture, but I think it's different. So I think of organizational culture as simply the way we do things here.
mm.
It's the
That's
way
a
we do
great
things.
way to describe it.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not tangible. We can measure it, but we can't see it.
Mhm,
We know when it feels healthy, we know when it feels unhealthy. And at the center of how we do things here usually are the deeply held values and beliefs that drive our behavior.
mhm,
We do what we do because of what we value and because of what we believe. So in organizational culture, how we do things here really does stem from those values and beliefs, whether they're conscious or unconscious, spoken about or not spoken about. Um, they still drive behavior.
mhm.
So
I
that's how do you think of it?
I love that definition that is so simple and concise. I have not known to be simple and concise. Simple, not always concise. Uh, but I like to think of culture as the difference between it's a river source. It's a water source that brings
Mm,
life, which is a little bit like the way we do things here. And cultures that are unintentional are like rivers. They flow where they flow and rivers follow the path of least resistance.
mhm,
And that means if it's hard, I move over here. This belief isn't actually matching what I say. So I'm going to go over this direction versus an aqueduct that really intentionally takes water into the places where we want to bring life. And
mm.
so it is the
I
way we
love
do
that.
things here, but it's the source of really the lifeblood of work. Like, what
Mm,
are we doing here? And I love the value piece of that because, as you said, whether we have named the values or not, they are informing our culture. And I feel like that place where like you said, you belong or it fits, are I think without fail places that are aligned in their culture. What we say is what we do. Even if I don't agree with it, what we say is what we do. And that builds trust and predictability for people versus places where what I say is different than what I do or our explicit versus implicit culture. They don't match.
yeah.
That's when we start to have that like buzzy feeling and like that feeling in your stomach where you're like, I don't, what's going on here? This feels awkward, but I can't name it. I think those are the places where there's a misalignment between the stated values and the actual way we do things here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ed Shine, who was a researcher in culture in OD, in my field of practice, organizational development, used to talk about, he passed a couple of years ago, he talked about espoused or professed culture
Mhm.
versus practiced culture.
Yeah.
And I sometimes say, are we walking our talk with how we do things here? Is it consistent? And, to your point, we as human beings we're very intelligent. We're emotionally intelligent. We're cognitively intelligent, and we can smell a rat. You know? Have you seen that guy, Jen, that produces it's a company now, I think. It used to be an individual. He produces these motivational posters that are like spoofs of
Oh my
motivation.
gosh, they're so funny.
They're so funny. They're so funny. But, you see these posters on the walls, like literally, that's the worst case for me of like espoused values where it says, teamwork makes the dream work. And it's like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, How am I
Right.
supposed to walk the talk of that
Mhm.
actual
Yeah.
value? And so there's dissonance. People don't understand what it means. They don't see their leaders acting in a way that's consistent with that. And it gets companies in real trouble in terms
Yeah.
of engaging their people fully.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about that. Ken Black was on the show earlier, and he also used to work at Nike. And really, we talked about values in that conversation and how, what is this like, the problem of engagement? What is that? We hear that, that's another buzzword, like employee
Yes.
engagement, and employee well being, which I love these things. These are good and right. But sometimes it's just like, oh, yeah, we got to get our engagement up. But there's a problem that is deeper. So tell us a little bit more about that disconnect there.
Yeah, I love what you said about these being buzzwords because they are, and we use them sort of willy-nilly sometimes. I mean, I put myself right in there. I'll
Yeah.
sometimes toss out these words: engagement, culture, team health, leadership health, and it's like, what am I really talking about there? So I appreciate your, diving into that a little bit more. Here's how I think of engagement, of employee engagement in particular. I think of it as the psychological and emotional connection
Mm,
we feel to our workplace and our coworkers.
that's good. I want you to say that again because I
Yeah.
think that's a really great way to describe what engagement actually means.
Yeah, yeah. So we think of it as the psychological and emotional connection that we feel to the workplace, and our coworkers.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
we at Momentum, we say that connection is the future of performance.
Mm,
So, organizations are communities, and 99% of all businesses are considered small to medium sized businesses, which, by the
absolutely.
way, is between
Yeah.
a million and 100 million. Most companies fit in the US in that category, which are
Totally.
under 500 employees. That's what our market is. But unfortunately, because of the way storytelling works and the way media works, the big companies, the mega companies, in
Mhm.
particular, the five big tech companies, have kind of excuse me, they've kind of ruled the roost around the myth that we have in our mind about what healthy culture looks like in organization. And so
Mm,
I just really like to drive back to remember the organizations that I'm talking about. I've worked with some of those mega companies, but they're not the majority employers in our
mhm.
country. The majority are much smaller companies, who have much higher stakes actually
Yeah.
for help, for engagement, because
Mhm.
of the cost to them when those employees leave or churn or are underperforming. Because if you've got
Mhm.
10,000 employees, one who's not performing well is not that much of an
Yeah.
issue. But if you have 40,
It's
it's
huge.
an issue.
It's really big, and, I was talking with my daughter in the car, and, the other day, and so we're sitting in the car talking about 5 years ago. When did
Mm,
this song come out? And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I think that's like 10 years old." She's like, "It's not 10 years old." And so, of course, we look it up, and she's like, "Gosh, I can't even believe that it's 5 years ago." And it's like, she's 15. I was like, "Well, that's a third of your life." It's a
right.
huge significant number for her. Whereas 5 years of my life is much closer to, 15% of my life. It's a
Right.
smaller, and which is why I was like, "It's like 10 years old." I don't know. We see time differently because of that. And that is the same thing that happens inside an organization. If I have a couple clients, their organizations are all under 50.
Yeah.
And so you have two people that are not getting along. You have two people, you have a leader and or one team of four who
Yeah.
is struggling to be productive or kind, or or whatever the difficulty is, and three decide to leave because that's what happens. 75% of why people leave is a difficult leader. That is huge. That
Yeah.
is a huge impact on your actual business.
Huge. Well, I love one of the things you say in Joyosity. You talk about um, the complexity of us as humans, right? Creating positive cultures with complex people. Like, it's my bias that we are all complex.
Absolutely.
We as humans are complex. We're imperfect.
Mhm.
We're messy.
Yes.
And those differences become, to your point, much more noticeable in small to mid-size entities, which are the majority of entities. They're
Mhm.
easier to kind of gloss over or even miss or not have to deal with as swiftly in much bigger companies. So I
Mhm.
think you and I are both in that same sweet spot.
Yeah. So we have culture as, the way we do things here.
Yep.
It causes your organization, whatever you are, whatever kind of business community you are,
Mhm. Yep.
nonprofit or corporate in that way. Um, if there is misalignment between the things that we say and the things that we do, that is what impacts people and reduces the engagement of, and I love this definition of engagement, of feeling that deep connection to the work that we do. It's the meaningful work, and the people that we work with, the humans that help us get it all done. And so when we think about the research that you've done and the curriculum that you've developed, I think is really fascinating. I think what you said is great. We feel it. What are some of the other impacts if we don't pay attention to culture? We don't make that intentional. If we're like, okay, bottom line first versus culture and people first, what happens?
Well, I think ultimately we can't attract and retain the key people we need, especially today. This is one of the things that's been really underlined by the COVID-19 global pandemic. And there's been some really good research. So I rewrote and reissued my second book, which is called Brave Space Workplace, Making Your Company Fit for Human Life. The new version of that is called When Work is Good. And the reason I did that is because of the new research that came out in COVID, because COVID, with everybody, so many people pivoting to remote work, we started to actually really see unprecedented levels of low employee engagement. And for a long time, do you remember back in the early days of COVID, there was a lot of myth and innuendo about people didn't want to work hard.
Yes.
They were taking federal money and they just didn't want to work hard, right? Yeah. And so we now know that was a myth. But one of the pieces of research that came out of that work was done by a father-son team through the MIT Sloan Management Review. And it looked at what really causes employee dissatisfaction and churn. And we know that culture is at the top of the list. So when we're in the consequences then of a culture that isn't joyful, isn't connecting, doesn't feel like community to employees, is that they don't see themselves there. They don't feel psychologically and emotionally connected there. And so they might still go to work, whether it's virtual work or going to an actual place, but they're not likely to stay there very long. So the investment the employer makes in their growth, in their learning, most jobs, even some entry-level jobs, take 6 months to a year to actually learn, right? So when you think about the cost of that kind of churn, the cost of losing an employee who you've already invested in developing, and the cost of an employee talking badly about their workplace. I was just at a retirement party for a friend of mine. And in that evening of like 10 women that were there, I heard more stories of job misery than I can even count. And these are women that are end stage career. They've either retired or they're close to retirement. And it breaks my heart. But when you hear those stories, of course, you're also asking, who do you work for? And you're making a note. Oh, that's interesting. That workplace doesn't seem like it's that great. If I'm looking for a new job, maybe I'm not going to go there. Maybe I'm not going to buy their product or service. So, word gets out.
Absolutely.
In addition to the dynamics of employee attraction and retention, there's one more thing I would say that's a real consequence of toxic culture. Well, there's two more things. One is the waste we incur trying to fix the problems that come up in toxic culture, right? So what people call people problems, some of the things you mentioned, tensions between people, leaders who are bad for people. We spend an inordinate amount of resources, time, energy, and money protecting ourselves from litigation and having to resolve these problems that are deeply rooted usually in toxic culture. The other thing that happens is we have employees coming to work with low engagement, which to me means they're bringing a mere fraction of their greatness.
Yeah.
Which is what I love about Joyosity, right? Because if I'm feeling joyful about work, if I get up and I'm like, I'm actually looking forward to going to work today, I bring more of my good stuff.
Oh yeah.
I just bring it. But if I'm thinking, oh, here we go again, I got to put in 8 or 9 hours at this job, I'm going to bring just the bare minimum and I'm going to leave my good stuff for my out of work activities, which really is expensive for the employer.
Yes. And I mean, the research, as I'm working on the book and digging into the organizational research around joy, there are so many productivity components when people feel connected, and they feel that they have meaningful and purposeful work, and that the people that they work with, they might not be their best friends. Like, just kind of dispel the myth that this needs to be your bestie that you go spend weekends in Nashville with. But just got back from one of those. Like that's not necessarily. I mean, sometimes you do find that, but you have a mutual respect that we are kind to one another. We speak in this way. The way we do things here is honoring the complexity of who you are as a human and your gifts and talents that are different than my gifts and talents. And I feel safe to fail. I feel safe to try in those kinds of spaces. And when you have that kind of joyful space, people are like 30% more productive, and they are more likely to help their other people, which keeps people out of the HR office.
Totally.
Like all of that kind of stuff. And the other thing that I think is so fascinating to me about the positive aspects of joy are that you don't have to spend every moment of every day loving what you do,
right?
Or every moment of every day feeling connected. Yeah. It's about 35 to 40% doing the work that you love, and only 10% doing the stuff that's really hard. So we can expect that there's still that 10% where you have a bad day and somebody else has a bad day and words are exchanged. And then we have to know what to do to smooth that over, to repair, to rebuild trust. And that is the work of a leader in building a culture in the way we do things here, because we admit that, my goodness, we're human. And there's going to be days like that.
Well, and I think about it. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think about it as, life isn't that way. Like, sure. When you've been married, I think you've been married, right?
We're at 27, something like that. I think.
Awesome. Good job. That's a huge accomplishment.
Do math.
Right. I've been married twice. So I've had two different experiences, right? And learned a lot from the first time around. But one of the things that strikes me is, when we get married on that day of the wedding, we make vows and we intend to practice those vows every day. And then we get 10 or 20 years in, or even 2, or even on our honeymoon, we start seeing, wait a second, the committing to these vows is really different in practice. And so we blow it with each other, and we have to repair. And the same is true at work. Work is work after all. It is not unicorns and rainbows all the time. And we all, human beings, are hardwired to understand that joy and happiness are not unrelenting, which makes them so precious when we feel them.
Yes.
Right? So we're not looking for 8 hours of joy every day. But some moments of joy are going to make those other hours of real toil or effort, or like you said, conflict or difficulty, really worth it. Because of the level of fulfillment that we get.
Yes. So we're going to pick this conversation up right there with joy and toil, because I have some thoughts around that. So join us for part 2 next week. So we're going to say goodbye for today, and we'll see you next week. So let me put my coach hat on for just a moment. Don't just leave this here. Take a moment. What did you learn? What's your next tiny action step? Share this episode with someone and tell them what you're going to do. Check the show notes for all the links and connect with us on LinkedIn and all the other socials, or just, drop me an email at Jen with 2 N's at jenwhitmer.com. We want to keep this conversation going with you. I know your earballs have a lot coming at them, so thank you for listening to the Joyosity podcast and being a part of our community. Please take a moment to rate and subscribe. It helps more people join us in the movement to create positive culture with complex people. So work is a joy, people are whole, and organizations flourish. Can't wait for you to join us next week.